Mr. Creighton, and I'm excited to get us started painting this semester. But before we can do any of that, we have to introduce the painting tools and supplies you'll use and reintroduce color and how to mix it. In order to get us ready for that, we're going to have a little presentation here called Painting 101. And right away, let's jump into the painting tools and supplies you'll use throughout this semester. So right away, you're going to be using brushes, of course, to paint. There's a couple different types of brushes that we'll use specifically, but also there's the parts of the brush. So what I'll have you do is write down the parts of the brush. So that's what we call brush anatomy. And eventually you'll be quizzed on this stuff, so you'll want to have these notes. But the top section that you'll actually use to paint is the bristles. Another word for that is the tuft, and that's really, really important when we paint that you take care of the bristles because if you let paint dry in the bristles, they become extremely stiff, and also it can potentially just ruin your brush. Another way to take care of your brush is to use cooler water or slightly warm water when you clean out your brush. You don't want to use hot water because it actually loosens the glue that holds your brush together. And so there's a metal piece in between the wood of the handle and also the bristles called the ferrule. And inside that ferrule is glue that actually holds the bristles in. So write down bristles, write down ferrule, which is that metal piece, and then of course the handle. So traditionally, we're going to use long-handled brushes because that allows for you to paint larger areas. But depending on what you're trying to paint, so if you're trying to paint something with a lot more detail, you hold the brush lower. And if you're trying to paint a larger area and cover it, you hold the brush higher. So we're going to use typically two types of brushes. There's a couple other different ones that we'll use, but the two main brushes that we use are a flat brush. So I'll have you write that down, please. A flat brush is a large flat. So we use a large flat, which is for the underpainting or a wash of color. And underpainting typically means just really the canvas that you cover before you start your finalized painting. So it's like the base that you build off of. It's kind of like if you're working on a drawing, you would create a sketch and then build your polished drawing over the top of that. So a large flat, we use a larger flat brush for that because it allows for us to cover the area quicker. And then there's also small flats. And a small flat we typically use to straighten up things or clean up the edges of your painting. So let's say you're painting a box, you would use that small flat brush, just the edge of it, to make sure that the edge of your box is clean and tight. So a small flat is used to straighten up and clean up edges. And then a large flat is typically used for the underpainting or to cover larger areas, so washes of color. We also use round brushes. So a round brush is great, specifically when you're trying to blend colors on your canvas. So a large round is for blending. So typically we'll use that. And we just kind of work it back and forth until you get your blending smooth and consistent. And then also we have a small round brush, which is for details. So to kind of recap, for the brush anatomy, we've got the bristles, so you can actually paint, take care of those things, please. The ferrule, which is the metal piece, which locks your bristles into place. The handle, which you'll use to paint, and depending on what you're painting and how large the area is, that depends on where you hold your brush. And then we have flat brushes and then round brushes, and you'll get a set of those to paint with this semester. So the other tools we'll use is a palette. So there's different types of palettes, but we're going to actually use the one that's in the middle, so that circle with those little wells, those little sections that you'll mix color in. So a palette is the surface an artist mixes paint on, as well as an arrangement of colors. Again, a palette is the surface an artist mixes paint on, as well as the arrangement of colors. And so why is this important to you? Well, arranging the colors on your palette in a logical way makes it easier for you to mix colors. It makes it more efficient. So if you look at the palette on the right side, you can kind of see that they have white and black on the far right corner, so those neutral colors. And then they actually have like a rainbow of colors, so the spectrum of colors. It's easier to set up your palette that way so you can easily mix colors without reaching across the palette. So if you're trying to make a lighter yellow, or sorry, lighter orange, then you want to have yellow next to it. So it's good to have those colors next to each other. And then traditionally to mix our colors, we use a palette knife. So write down palette knife as well. A palette knife is a utensil you use to mix colors. So there's different types of palette knives. Our palette knife we're going to be using is second from the bottom. So a palette knife is important when it comes to mixing your colors. It's a way for you to protect your brushes. If you mix your colors with your brushes a lot, you could potentially ruin the shape of your brushes if you're not careful. So a palette knife will help us take care of those things because you'll need them all semester. And of course, if you take care of them really well, you'll get to keep them. So, all right, so let's get on to our color theory. All right, so here's the deal. Again, the only thing you have to write down is just the term, so the term in red and the black definition behind it. But I'm going to break down what color is and then hue. So color is just the visible spectrum of reflected light. So it's just the spectrum of light, and that's where we kind of produce our colors from. We kind of use that as our guide, and that's what the color wheel is. But it's the visible spectrum of reflected light, so it's the full spectrum of colors that we'll use. And then a hue is actually technically what we paint with. A hue is the original unaltered color, and that's what you get out of your tubes. So you'll have, like a tube of yellow, red, blue, green, and so on. So without mixing it, that's what a hue is. You'll hear me use that term occasionally, but a hue is the original unaltered color. So you're going to get a set of tubes, and then before you mix that, that's what we call a hue. And then when you mix it, you're creating your own color from there. So there are three major types of colors that we'll use. And you've probably heard this stuff in grade school, or if you had a painting class with me previously, you've heard these before, but they're the primary and secondary colors. So the primary colors will be that inside ring. So the inside ring of three colors. So that color, so write down primary color, please. Primary color is color that cannot be created through mixing. Again, the primary color is color that cannot be created through mixing. So in order to make that full color spectrum, so the idea of that rainbow of colors, you need to have those three colors to start with. If you don't have them, it's going to be very difficult to make the other ones, if not impossible. And then the second ring in our color wheel is the secondary colors. There's three of those, which are orange, violet, and green. And that is an equal mixture of two primary colors. So secondary colors are an equal mixture of two primary colors, and it might not be perfectly equal, but pretty close. Sometimes you have to use a little bit more of the lighter color, but it's an equal mixture of two primary colors. And why is this important? Well, having an equal mixture keeps your colors consistent. And if you have too little or too much of one of those primaries, it's going to dominate the other. And then it will eventually appear to be too light or too dark, and it's going to throw things off. So an equal mixture or close to it is extremely helpful. And also a tip for color mixing, because you will be mixing colors soon. It is easier when you're mixing colors in your palette to put down the lighter color first and then slowly mix in the darker color, because darker colors are more dominant and they'll take over the lighter colors. So let's say you're trying to make green. Well, that top section, if you look here, that top part is incorrect. You'd want to put down yellow and then mix in blue slowly to get green. If you're trying to make orange, that one is correct, however. So you'd want to put down yellow, mix in a little bit of red, and you mix in more to try to get a good mixture of orange. But start with yellow and then add red. And then if you are trying to make violet, red is actually the lighter color. So you want to put down red, slowly mix in blue, and then create violet. And what I mean by slowly mix, I mean add typically a little bit at a time. If you just throw in blue, it may dominate the red, and then your violet will be too dark, so a slower mixture is best. All right, so we got one more term here for you, and that is tertiary colors. All right, so tertiary color is a mixture of a primary and secondary color. Again, a tertiary color is a mixture of a primary and secondary color. And why is this important? Well, it's extremely important because tertiary colors in a painting is what you'll use to make your painting look three-dimensional. So if you're trying to paint a tree, if you look at that painting of the tree on the left side, there's a ton of green, but there's shades of green, or not necessarily shades, but there's different versions of green. And so how that was created for the most part was by mixing in another color, a tertiary color, to work with that green. So the idea of mixing in yellow green, so a lighter version of green, and then also a green blue, which is a darker version of green, to make those trees look three-dimensional, to give them lighter and darker areas. And then for a tertiary color, you're always going to have one primary color and then one secondary color in order to make it. So yellow green, green blue, blue violet, red violet, orange red, and yellow orange. Those are all important in order to make this thing work. So if I pull this up, just so you guys can take a look at it real quick. So you guys are eventually going to be working on a color wheel, and so it looks like this. This is actually the key for it. So you would actually create, or you actually fill in, you don't have to create them. You'd fill in the primary colors, and then in your palette, you would put down yellow, and then put down red, and then mix those together in your palette to fill this section in orange. So let's say you're going to try to make then the tertiary colors. So we have primary, secondary, and then tertiary. These first three are going to be yellow-orange. So what you would do eventually is slowly add in more orange. So you're going to place yellow in your palette. So you place down yellow first, mix in a tiny bit of orange, and then mix in more orange in order to make that darker. These three colors are what we call orange-red. So you're going to be using, of course, orange and red. You'd put down orange in your palette with a tiny bit of red. So you mix in a tiny bit of red and then more red as you go. And that's the key, is that you start with one color and you slowly mix in. So these are red violets. We start with red, slowly mix in a little bit more violet. These are violet blues. Start with violet, slowly mix in more blue. These are yellow green. Start with yellow, slowly mix in a little bit more green to make it darker. These are green blues. Start with green in your palette, slowly mix in a little bit more blue to make it darker. And that's the key, is it's showing you all of the different versions of those colors, and you'll use those versions in order to make your paintings look more three-dimensional and more authentic. And we'll get to this in a second. So moving back to our presentation here. So monochromatic color is what you saw at the bottom of that worksheet. So monochromatic color, mono means one, and chromatic or chroma means color. So it's one color that is changed through value gradations. So write down monochromatic again. So monochromatic is one color that is changed through value gradations. And value is the lightness or darkness of something, if you remember that from intro to drawing, and a gradation just means it gradually changes. So write down value. Value is the lightness or darkness of an element. So an element is what we use to make art, so line, shape, color. So you can have lighter and darker lines, lighter and darker shapes, lighter and darker colors. A surface, so could be the table, there's lighter and darker parts of that, or a color. So why is this important? It's a really simple way to make your painting look three-dimensional. It's a way to make a color lighter and darker so the object you paint feels 3D. It's one of the easiest ways. So you would choose a color. This will actually be one of our first paintings. You would choose a root color, the root meaning the color that you start with and you build off of. So this artist is working with a green blue. So you choose that color and you use white to tint it and make it lighter. And you're going to use black to shade it and kind of tone it down, and that's the key. So in that worksheet, you would do the exact same thing. If you take a look at this, the bottom of this worksheet, you are going to place your root color. So the root color here is red. You place that in the middle. And then in your palette, you would slowly mix in white to make it lighter. And then you use another palette space, place red there, and you slowly mix in black. The key is that you want to slowly do it because black is dominant. It's a very dominant value. So less is more in this case, so that way it doesn't get too dark too quickly, but you would slowly mix in black in each rectangle on that worksheet in order to make it darker. So we're going to cover just a few more terms of monochromatic, our monochromatic scale there, and then we're going to move on to that second worksheet in the terms that fit it. All right, so here's the deal. Monochromatic color has 3 terms. Actually write down all 4, including saturation. So the first term is tint, which is using white. If you want to just abbreviate it and just write using white, that's perfectly fine. But it's using white to make the color lighter. Again, tint is using white to make the color lighter. The second term is tone, and tone is using gray to make the color dull or more neutral. So it's using gray to make the color more dull or neutral, which fits with that fourth term called saturation. When a color is saturated, it's pretty bright. It's typically more intense in its original state, and using gray is one way to take the brightness out of that color. So let's say you want to paint something that was further away. You could use a little bit of gray to make it a little bit more dull, because as things are further away, they're less intense in color, they're not as clear, they're harder to see. So using a little bit of gray will take care of that. So the third term is shade. Shade is using black to make the color darker, which is pretty simple. So tint is white, tone is gray, and shade is black. And then the last term there is saturation. Saturation is the brightness or intensity of the color. So if you look on the far left, you look at the scale, the reds over here are more saturated, they're more bright and more intense. And as we move over to the right, that gray is toning the color down. So the more gray we add, the more neutral this color becomes. So gray is one way to do that. There's some other colors you can mix in to make colors more neutral and dull, but gray is a very simple way to do it. So with that being said, let's move over to the other colors or color schemes on the color wheel. So we only have a few more to write down here. This one's kind of a weird sounding word. That is analogous. So this word is analogous. Analogous is groups of color that are adjacent, aka next to each other on the color wheel. So analogous is groups of color that are adjacent next to each other on the color wheel. So if you look at this color wheel here, so this entire section, these are shades of violet. So we have our red violets and then our violet blues. These colors are all adjacent. So why is this important? Analogous colors are really consecutive colors on the color wheel. An analogous color scheme is used for something like leaves, a flower, anything that has similar colors is an analogous color scheme. So if you're trying to paint grass, which is typically green as the root color, then you're going to use yellow greens and green blues typically. If you look at this flower, the root color is orange, But we clearly have some yellow oranges in here in order to make it lighter. We have some orange reds in here, so shades of orange red or versions of orange red to make it darker. And that way, this flower feels three-dimensional. There's a little bit of white and looks like brown or black to make that kind of shade of brown in the orange. But for the most part, we're using yellow to help that orange and then red to help that orange. So that's what analogous means. Groups of colors that are adjacent, so next to each other. So this entire section is analogous, this section's analogous, and this section's analogous. So it's colors that are next to each other. So again, they're frequently used in many paintings because they are similar, which gives it a sense of unity. So again, this yellow, orange, red, orange. So any groups of colors that are next to each other, like in this painting, this is a painting of this boat at night. Well, this painting uses a lot of blues. So it uses some blue violets. It uses just also some tints of blue too as well. So some yellow, some lighter blues. Also, there are some green blues, more like an aqua type of color in there as well. So they're all analogous. They're all similar and next to each other. So you'll do a worksheet eventually where you're going to have to create 3 analogous colors. So 3 colors that are similar to each other, and you'll paint those in. So our next color scheme is complementary colors, or complementary, if you want to pronounce it that way. But complementary colors, so write down this term. Complementary colors are essentially colors that are opposite of each other on the color wheel. Again, they are colors that are opposite of each other on the color wheel. And why is this important to you? Well, this is important because you can dull a color by mixing in a little bit of the color's complement. So if you wanted to dull down red, you can mix in a little bit of green. So there are colors that are opposites. So you can mix in a little bit of green to the red. It's going to dull it and neutralize it. If you want to make a duller version of orange, you can mix in a little bit of blue. If you want to dull down violet, or sorry, you want to dull down yellow, you can mix in a little bit of violet. So these colors complement each other, and they kind of it'll take down the brightness of it. And then also, here's the deal. If you want to make a color stand out, you can place it next to its complement. So if you look at these lines, the lines are super easy to see. And the reason why is the complement is next to it. So if you want to make your color stand out in front of a background, place a complement behind it, and it'll make your color easy to see due to the color contrast. That's one of the highest color contrasts you can have in your painting. So again, red, green, yellow, and violet. We don't use the P word around here. So yellow and violet, and then also blue and orange. Those are our complements. And so anything across, so if we have even our blue and all of these shades or versions, that is versions of orange over here, these are still complements. And you'll see them in paintings. Again, if you look at these oranges, they stand out next to blue so well because it's contrast. So the more contrast you have in your painting, the easier it is for you to see the focus of your painting, so the focal point. And on your worksheet, you're actually going to place one color down, place the complement down, and then mix them together so you can see how they cancel it out. So if you look at this, you can see how it makes this neutral shade of green. It just makes a like a murkier and more neutral and washed out dull version of green. Our last colors that you'll need to write down are warm and cool. So warm is a color that gives off a psychological feeling of warmth. So again, please make sure you're writing this down. So warm colors is color that gives off a psychological feeling of warmth. Think sunlight. So think about colors that you typically see even more seasonally, like in clothing and fabrics and things like that in the summer. So yellows, shades of orange and reds, that is a warm color. And then cool is color that gives off a psychological feeling of coolness. So think moonlight. Again, cool is color that gives off a psychological feeling of coolness. Think moonlight. So you have blue, green, violet, and all of their versions, all the tertiary color versions. So our green blues, our blue violets, and that's really the key here. So we have all these are cool. Think about moonlight, and you'll see that in this painting of the frog. You'll also see it in the painting of the pepper, which of course is hot. So on your worksheet, you are going to have to make 4 warm colors. So you can't put down red, you can't put down yellow, you have to make a version of it. So you can mix in a version of red, so even pink by using white, you can make shades of red or versions of red, versions of orange, versions of yellow. Same thing here. You can't just put down a pure blue. So it has, like, this is actually a darker shade of blue. So by mixing in violet or mixing in a little bit of black, or even having shades of green. So you have to create a version of it. You can't just put down an unmixed version. And then on your worksheet as well, you're going to have to make a warm version of a color and also a cool version of a color. So in this case, put down red, mixed in a little bit of orange to make it warmer and a little bit brighter, and then mix in violet to make it just a little bit cooler. So you'll pick one color as the root, so the color you start with, make it warmer, make it cooler, and that's how you get points from that. All right, so what your worksheet will look like in this case for your color mixing. So this is the color theory worksheet. Again, you're going to do a saturation section. You would pick a root, so you'll always start with the root color, and then mix in a little bit of gray to make it less saturated, so more dull and neutral, and even more gray to make it even less saturated. Again, in this section, you have to make the colors, so you can't just put down red, you have to make shades of it, or shades of yellow, shades of orange, etc. Shades of cool colors. There is an analogous color section where you're going to paint in 3 colors that are similar, so 3 that fit an analogous color scheme. You'll do a complementary color section, pick a color of your choice, pick a color that's opposite, and then mix them in. And in this section, you're going to choose a root color of your choice, make a warmer version, make a cooler version, and you'll get a point for each one. So that's really going to be demonstrating the color theory knowledge that we covered in our presentation. And then once we get a little bit of experience mixing colors, it will be time to really get our practice in and get rolling on our first painting of the semester.